It's so good to see you for this first webinar of this term. Thank you so much for joining with us, and we look forward to interacting with you. We don't actually have the A team today because Kirsty, our wonderful tech person, is not well today and not able to be with us. So if the tech is just a little tiny bit clunky, that's because we're trying to fill in for Kirsty the wonderful. My name's Pam, and for those of you I haven't met, I've been working for CPAS for the last 7 years. For those of you who don't know what CPAS is, it's an Anglican evangelical mission agency working in the UK, resourcing leaders, running holidays for young people, and we are patrons to around 690 churches. So 3 main areas of activity. There is a link to a handout that you should have had, and we hope that you've managed to print out the handout. And if you haven't done so, it might be worth doing now just so that you can keep track of everything. Before we pray, let me ask James to introduce himself and Jo to say hello to. Thank you. James first, then Jo.
Great, thanks, Pam. Good morning, everyone. James Lawrence, also work at CPAS. Really looking forward to spending this hour with you. And we're going to be doing what we normally try to do on these webinars, talk a little bit about where things are at today. And I'm going to be interviewing Jo about that, and then do some time in breakout rooms, and then also talk a little bit about what would godly leadership look like in these continued demanding times. Jo.
Sorry, just struggling with the technology there. Just a welcome from me, and I'm based in North Manchester in a medium-sized church in a working class context, and I have to say currently it's a bit grey outside.
Thanks, Jo. Thank you, Jo. We will, as always, finish promptly at 11 o'clock, but we will stay around for a bit if anyone has further questions. So before I hand over to James, let's pray together. This is the day that the Lord has made. We will rejoice and be glad in it. Loving God, we thank you for this day. We thank you for your good purposes for us in it. We thank you for your call on our lives in it. We thank you for your presence with us in all that we do. So we commend to you now our time together, asking that for each of us, the 2 or 3 things you want us to learn today and to take away with us will stand out clearly for us. And we ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. James, I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Pam. Well, folks, as always, we want to just try and capture a little bit of where we think things are at today. And the way we're going to do that is I'm going to interview Jo and ask her a little bit about her context. And there's a sense, I think, in which as a country, many of us feel like we're holding our breath at the moment to see what actually is going to happen over these coming weeks. And there are also some very interesting stats that have been around sort of church leaders. And if we have time, I might say a little bit more about those. But Jo, let me begin with you, if I may. Just tell us a little bit more about the context in which you're operating. You're a vicar.
Yeah, so I'm an incumbent full-time, and I'm also at CPAS Leadership Enabler with the responsibility for the Arrow programme. That's what I forgot to say beforehand, and I realised afterwards if I hadn't said that. I'm in a working class context, and like many of you that are joining us today, it's that coming back to leading church again in a different way.
So what are you experiencing in your leadership at the moment?
Yeah, well, I've been thinking about this because it feels like we're on a bit of a roller coaster at the moment. And so I feel like I'm experiencing wonderful times and seeing God at work, weird times, and also wearing times. I think that would be my summary.
Okay, great. Wonderful, weird and wearying. Tell us a bit about the wonderful times, first of all.
Okay, this might sound really strange, but I feel like a vicar again, not just a ministry operations manager. I'm able to be back in school. I can take home communion. Now, I never thought I would delight in that as much as I am. And doing the occasional offices again. So, yeah, just those things that we've kind of missed out on in the last 18 months. I'm also really enjoying re-establishing the relationships in the community, especially in school, and they seem to have gone much deeper than they were before. Obviously, it's great to physically meet together for services, meetings, toddler group, and actually at that toddler group, meeting non-Christians again in a way that haven't had the opportunity to speak about Jesus, and then just that opportunity to refocus church and make sure that the vision is there and our eyes are on Jesus. So there seems like many opportunities and new people and those kind of things. So those are the wonderful aspects of ministry at the moment.
That's great to hear. So you said wonderful, but then you also said weird. So tell us a little bit more about the sort of weird times that you're experiencing at the moment.
Yeah, so weird in the sense of the virus hasn't gone. In some environments, it feels like the restrictions have never been in place. I don't know if that's just my context, but on Saturday night, just gone at 9:30, I had a text from my head teacher saying that 16 of my year 3 year group have COVID and 4 teachers have COVID, and COVID's throughout the school. And just to let you know, your all age service tomorrow, Harvest, might be a bit disrupted. You might want to think about it, doing it differently. And so, it's that weird times of responding to cases and how you keep people safe. And also, I don't know who's going to come back yet to my congregation. We aren't all back, especially the families, and especially those who in the past have volunteered. It feels like many of my volunteers haven't stepped back up.
Why do you think that is, Jo? What is it that is keeping them back?
I wonder whether a number of them have had time to reevaluate their priorities, and sadly some of those have come to the conclusion that church isn't a priority. They like to go and do golf on a Sunday morning, or they might want to go and see family, which I can understand if you haven't seen family for a long time. Also, there is a sense of, oh, well, we've been doing this for years. Oh, let's hand it on to someone else. Well, that's great if you know who you're going to hand it on to. But if you don't know who's coming back, there is just a gap. And I have to say, James, in terms of my own emotional stuff, that really feeds into my own fears and actually personal failure. Kind of what happens if my church shrinks. Now, I know that it's God's and it's his bride, but it doesn't stop me from having those fears and the concerns of failure. Yeah.
And I think you said something also about desk time and diary and just having to rethink all of that again.
Yeah, I mean, so much of our time in the last 18 months has been desk based, and also meetings have been online and kind of scheduled, and that's all kind of different. So you're doing online stuff and you're physically present. And what I'm finding is that when I schedule a meeting to last an hour, it'll tend to be an hour and a half, just because people are excited about seeing one another, and the chat at the beginning expands, and then chat at the end expands. And those things I haven't factored back in, that actually meeting in person takes much longer than when we meet on Zoom.
And sort of, how are you finding re-engaging with things that you used to do but haven't done for a long time?
Yeah, so I feel, as I said, okay, I feel like a vicar again, but it also feels like I'm a new vicar. So it feels like I've just arrived in parish and I don't quite know how the communion works, and I don't quite know how the toddler group works, because everything feels like it's the first time again. And obviously with all those risk assessments and the different COVID kind of safety stuff that we might have in place, just means that communion is different, or toddler group is different. And in me, I'm not very good at firsts. Once I've done it once, I'll be okay. But there is a sense of loss of sleep the night before stuff, because I'm just wondering how it's going to go.
And what are you doing? Thanks, Jo. What are you doing about the balancing of on-site and online?
Yeah, so we are playing with it, if that makes sense. We're kind of seeing how it responds. So actually, my PCC meeting, I'm now offering it in person and online, because a number of my families really appreciated it being online, because it meant that they didn't have to get babysitters. However, it is hard. It's very much like you have to repeat what has been said in the room, which is good for clarity, but that also takes longer. So yeah, and I think PCC meetings have been less productive in that way.
Interesting. Okay. Anything else on that weird bit before I ask you about the weary bit?
Yeah, I think the last thing I would say about the weird bit is actually I don't know where God is leading our church. Now, that might be my particular context. Obviously, I've got, the vision, which is, keep your eyes on Jesus, making Jesus known. That's great. But actually how we fulfill those things because of volunteers and because of changes that are happening within church and in diocese, that's hard to know what that is at the moment.
Okay, great. Thank you. Say a little bit about the sort of the wearing things in all of this.
Yeah, I mean, decision making, I think, I find wearing. Obviously, during the pandemic, we made a succession of quick decisions at the beginning, what we're going to do, and then decisions as we've gone through with the releasing of restrictions. And maybe in my naivety, I thought that the toughest part was going in or maybe coming out. Well, actually, coming out is, I think, the more difficult. But at this time, I'm weary of making decisions, but also at the moment I'm having to make decisions, and sometimes people are really happy with them because it's really cautious, and some people don't like them because they're overcautious, and then you're trying to manage people's expectations in the decisions that you're making. Yeah,
okay, great. Let me just ask you one more thing. What do you think in the light of all this wonderful, weird and wearing stuff? What are you learning, do you think, at the moment in terms of your leadership?
Yeah, I think there's something about practical stuff, which is the online, on site. So actually being recognised that sometimes being in person can be less productive, but that's okay because people need that time physically to be together at the same time. And that's not only happening in church life, it's happening in other live settings such as counselling as well. I think one of the other practical things that we've learned is that people need help coming back to church, and that's wearing too, because you have to keep on encouraging them. But in terms of what I've learned over the summer is that if I don't say, "Oh, isn't it great to see you back?" people can be really upset. Now, I know that if you're in a large church, that can be really difficult. But actually, we have had to be, and I have had to be very intentional to really look out for who's returned, and just to have that word that says, "Hey, it's great to see you back," even if it's just that. Because people, when I haven't done that, have said, "Well, what was the point of me coming back? You ignored me." And so actually, it's recognising it's really significant for them coming back, and a big thing, even if it's not a big thing for us. I mean, obviously it is a big thing for us, but just that personal thing. And I think that the key thing in this for me has been, and this is not rocket science or a revelation, that prayer really is the key, and being rooted, because all that kind of fear stuff, anxiety stuff, overwhelmed, oh my word, prayer is like breakfast. If we don't have breakfast, we can be grumpy. Our day can be muddled. And actually, Jesus is the one that has sustained me, and particularly over this time. I don't know whether many of us will recognise it, but that kind of ordination, or our ordination charge for those of us who are Anglican, it reminds us that we cannot bear this weight of calling on our own. We need to ask God for his power and his grace. We need to pray that our hearts would be enlarged, and we need to pray that he helps us read the scriptures and understand them, and we need to pray for the Holy Spirit. And so prayer has been a key learning experience for me.
Brilliant, Jo. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing so honestly about some of the anxiety and the inner stuff that goes on. I think that's so helpful, just to hear honestly about some of that. Really grateful. Folks, we're going to do two things at this point. First of all, we're going to run one of our little polls. We'd love to hear just about where things are at for you. And then secondly, we're going to go into breakout rooms, which Pam will tell us a bit more about in a moment. But let me, if I may, just launch a poll. You'll find it hopefully on your screen, a poll apologies to those of you who have devices, which means you can't see this, but for many of you, it will be there. There are 3 questions. Just go with your gut responses. On the first question, you can tick multiple answers. On the second 2 questions, it's only 1 answer per question. And we were just intrigued to find out where you're at in all of this. So the first one is about how are you feeling as we head into the autumn? The second one is about what you're doing in terms of your main services. And the third one is just about numbers and how things are going in terms of numbers for your main services. We know that's not everything, but nonetheless, as Jo's indicated, it can be an encouragement or a discouragement, depending on which way things are going. So just take a moment to fill in the poll. And then don't forget to submit poll at the bottom of the page. And again, apologies for those of you who can't do this, but we'll give you another 30 seconds for those of you who can. And another 15 seconds. That's 85% have participated so far, nearly there. And just a couple more seconds. Okay, we're going to end the poll now. There we go. And I'll just share the results with you so we can have a quick look through. Hopefully those are up on your screen now. So interesting, between those first 3 things about how we're feeling, a pretty even match between excited, concerned and overwhelmed. Probably not entirely surprising. In terms of what we're doing in the main services, just scroll down and you'll see that in building and streaming online, there's 50% of us, and then varying ones otherwise. And then, and the third question, less than we were before COVID, seems to be the majority still. 66% are in that place. Just interesting to see, isn't it, where we're at as a group. Great, thanks so much for doing that. Pam, back to you.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Jo. Jo, thank you so much for your honesty. Really helpful for us to learn from you. So, folks, we're going to go into breakout rooms to think about the things that we've heard and discuss how things are going for us. There'll be some messages that come, some questions that come up in the chat for you. We know it's always a bit awkward being thrust into a room with people you maybe don't know, but just briefly introduce yourselves, appoint someone maybe to chair the time. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you had some really good discussions. We're not yet going to go to Q&A. We've got another thing to do first, and James is going to give us some input on his latest thoughts on where we are. Thanks, James.
Thanks so much, Pam. And thank you again to Jo for such a helpful insight into the realities of leadership at the moment. Folks, what I want to try and do is just to ask the question, how do we exercise godly leadership in a time like this? And I'm going to share my screen and just offer a few thoughts. I was very fortunate early on in the summer to get away on holiday to the Lake District. And the weather was sort of reasonable and I was able to do some walking, which I love. I'm not a great mountain walker, but I like a good walk. And on one occasion, I was on the top of this mountain. I don't even know the name of it, and trying to make my way down, and I got completely lost. I was in the middle of a sort of scrub heather place, no path, didn't know which way to go, and was getting a little bit worried about how to get my way back down this mountain. I had a sense that if I headed in one particular direction, that might be the right way to go. So I waded through the sort of the heather and various other stuff and eventually came across one of these and was so grateful. It was a waymark on a path and it pointed me in the right direction. Actually, the rest of the walk was no easier. The rest of the walk was actually quite hard, but at least I knew I was on the right path. And every now and then I came across another waymark to point me in the right direction. And I simply want to offer what I think might be 4 waymarks for us in this particular time. Here's my first. Don't lose heart. Do take heart in God. I find it strangely encouraging that when Paul writes about not losing heart in 2 Corinthians 4, I'm encouraged because it reminds me that he probably was actually struggling with the temptation to lose heart, which makes him a little bit more human, more like me. Because I've certainly known in this season all sorts of challenges around not losing heart. But if we want to exercise godly leadership above all else, maybe what we need to do is to root ourselves in God, to take heart in God in this season. And I wonder if I can suggest 3 areas to take heart in: God's character, his call, and his promise. Very briefly, take heart in this season in God's character. I've been reading through the Psalms, and in Psalm 59, I came across this verse a few weeks ago. You are my strength. I watch for you. You, God, are my fortress, my God on whom I can rely. That has been an enormous encouragement to me. In fact, I wrote it down, and I wrote it down also for this webinar. It's good to be reminded, isn't it, that God is our strength, that he's watching out for us. He's our fortress. We can rely on him. Sisters and brothers, let's take heart in God's character. He has not changed. He is the same God today. Let's take heart in God's call. He's called us to this particular role of leadership that we find ourselves in. And because he's called us, he knew that COVID was going to be part of this experience. And therefore, he has prepared good works in advance for us to do, even during COVID. That verse in Ephesians 2:10 is such a help, isn't it? It reminds us that God's got good stuff for us to do. And he's known all along that we would have to find some of that good stuff in the midst of our leadership leading through COVID. He's called us. Take heart in that call. And thirdly, God's promises. Take heart in his promises. I love that verse in 1 Corinthians 15:58, where Paul says, he gives himself fully to the work of the Lord because he knows that he's working for him and his labor will not be in vain. So too for us. We can take heart in that promise of God that we are actually working for him and our labor will not be in vain. We may not see the fruit of our labor immediately, or maybe even in the longer term future, but we can trust that God will be working in us and God will be working through us. We labor for him and our labor is not in vain. I think that's helpful because one of the challenges of this season is that nagging question, is it all worth it? And God's answer is yes. Trust in my promise. You're working for me and I will bring about good things through this. Tim Keller says this: the way to strength is through weakness. That weakness is the doorway into the provisions and purposes of God, not our abilities or our status or any of the trappings we might usually associate with greatness, but our weakness. May we pause just for a moment. Take heart, sisters and brothers. These things are true. Godly leadership roots itself not in the circumstances around us, but in God himself. Now, I've taken quite a lot of time on that first waymark because it is the most important. But here are the others. The second waymark on our journey might be this: don't try to do everything, do prioritize with others. Part of the challenge at the moment is recalibrating our diaries to the new normal. It's what Jo was just talking about a moment ago. Things take longer when you're meeting on site than when you're meeting online. And part of it is also juggling all the possibilities of the challenges and opportunities of the season. Godly leadership seeks God's perspective and his priorities. And that's often upside down. Just because everyone wants something done and is clamoring for our attention around that thing doesn't necessarily mean it's the right thing to do. God's perspective often leads to different priorities. And I wonder, therefore, if a couple of questions for us to be reflecting are questions like this. What is the one thing God would have us focus on this week? What is the one thing God would have us focus on this month? And to chat with others as much as that is possible, to discern more clearly where his priorities might be. And those priorities might lie outside what everyone is clamoring for us to do. Let's not try to do everything. Let's try and prioritize with others. Here's the third waymark on the journey. Don't bemoan what you lack. Do plan with what you have. It's very easy to lose focus at the moment and to focus on what we don't have rather than what we do have. Now, of course, we need to acknowledge the differences between before COVID and now and mourn our losses. But the key is not to get stuck in looking back to what we don't have, but is to move through that to look forward and plan with what we do have. And it's not easy. I was talking to a clergy person last week who actually started her incumbency during lockdown and really wants to be moving forward, but is struggling because everyone in the congregation is looking back to what they've lost. And I wonder if that's not if that's quite a common experience. Anne Calver gave a little illustration which I found helpful. She said it's a wardrobe moment. And the analogy she used was this. It's like all your clothes are out of the wardrobe and on the bed. And as you look at them, you need to work out which are the ones that are going to go back into the wardrobe because they still fit, and which ones don't fit and actually need to go to the charity shop. We need to sort our wardrobe out on the basis of what we have and not what we don't have. And so too in our leadership at this time. Godly leadership builds with what God has given us. Don't be tempted by looking elsewhere, what other people have. Look at what we have. And therefore, maybe to get our church team or our PCCs to ask questions around what are the needs of our community and how can we meet those? How can we move from being a programming institution to a disciple-making movement? What are we about at this time? What can we do with what God has given us? Carrie Newhoff says this: when the future is unclear, focus on the mission, flex with the methods. I find that helpful as well. Because this is a real challenge, and a number of you have asked us about this, we're going to be running a workshop on strategic planning in a time of uncertainty on the 13th of October. It's just a couple of hours, 2.5 hours on Wednesday the 13th. So if you'd be interested, do sign up for that, because we want to think much further about how do we move forward at a time when there is still so much uncertainty around. Here's the fourth waymark on the journey. Don't neglect yourself. Do find a sustainable way of leading. And the analogy that I've been using over these last few weeks is that I think many of us normally would go through our summer period, have a slower pace, a bit of a holiday, and enter the madness of September. And it's always mad, isn't it, September? Feeling recharged. But the reality is, I've talked to so many church leaders who are saying, I don't feel recharged in the same way. Summer was actually pretty busy. There have been loads of decisions we've had to make, lots of things that have continued to demand energy of me. And we've entered the madness of September, which is actually even more demanding than usual because of our unusual circumstances, not feeling fully recharged. One church leader said this to me. He said that actually in his congregation, there are quite a few people who have come up to him in September raring to go. They've recharged themselves well. And he says, that's just at a point where I'm feeling like I don't have any energy to give to new things. I've not fully recharged myself. And actually, research is showing that a whole bunch of clergy have been working outside their normal sort of fit, their shape as a clergy person or as a church leader, and have actually experienced something of a drop in their sense of vocational fulfillment. And that also means we're not quite in that place where we're ready to take on everything that could be taken on. So I wonder what this might look like for you, not to neglect yourself, but to find a sustainable way of leading within this season. One of my team alerted us to a prayer that I found really helpful to be praying. God, help me to walk slowly enough to experience Jesus fully and love people deeply. That's a great prayer to be praying. What does a sustainable pace look like for you? Godly leadership combines godly self-denial with godly self-care. So here are the 4 waymarks on the journey: to root ourselves, not in the circumstances around us, but in God himself. To seek God's perspective and priorities, to build with what God gives us, and to combine godly self-denial with godly self-care. May God help us to lead well in a godly way in these demanding times.